Thanks very much for that thorough introduction. I appreciate that. I'm very happy to be here talking about this, talking on this topic. And I do need to make sure that I can advance slides. Technology, no problem. There we go. Okay. So any talk about the future of traffic safety needs to start with historical context. And so for today's historical context, I have provided the graph of fatality rate per 100 million VMT in the U.S. for the last 102 years, which is the total time frame that data are available for this particular rate. And what you can see is it has actually been going down steadily, and we made a lot of progress, especially in the early days. But probably you also noticed that in the last, 20 to 30 years, it's really flattening out. And I think that's plausibly because we knocked off, let's say, the low-hanging fruit for safety. Like early days, getting everyone to drive on the same side of the road was a thing. And so having done that, I think a lot of progress was made in like those first few years. But now we're really wrestling with pretty gnarly problems, drunk driving, speeding, distraction, and some other kinds of things that are making incremental progress, but it's quite challenging. But the last sort of decade-ish of development of automated driving systems really sort of it has the promise of, by replacing the human driver with a theoretically very intelligent robot, gives really the promise of making significant progress on this downward progress on this problem. And so it is reasonable and interesting to think about what the sort of future, or at least the recent past into the future, might look like with the sort of increased development and increased deployment of automated driving systems. So I provide a graph, and here I've replaced fatality rate with crash rate because realistically that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk, and there's time. And let's say it starts maybe at the beginning of kind of ADS development, which is whatever, a decade ago, something like that. Somebody will tell me that I'm wrong about that. But and we can imagine, or we certainly expect, that ADS safety crash rate will go down over time. That's kind of the point of deployment and testing, and that's a focus of what companies are doing in development. And so this is expected trajectory. And if all we wanted to do was to measure that trajectory, it would actually be pretty easy, right? So because the ADS companies have sensors all over these vehicles, and they know where they're going and how far they've gone. And it's pretty easy to tell, did things get better? I drove another, 100,000 miles or 1,000,000 miles. Did the rate of whatever the event was that I don't want, did that go down? And so we can sort of trace that. But even if you can show that, which again is pretty straightforward from a data point of view, it's useful to sort of think, well, where are we? What does it mean? To sort of put context on that. And realistically, the only context we have for crash rates is human drivers. This is the world that we live in. This is the world we're driving in. We're traveling. This group came here. And so there was travel involved. We're willing to do it in the current, sort of crash rate situation. And so I've put human drivers on here, and I give them a little bit of benefit of the doubt, slope going down. But you can imagine that somewhere in time is this trajectory. And the question is, where are we now? Okay. So the thing that we want to be able to ask is, are we here? Is this what's going on right now? Are we here? Or are we here? Are we here where ADS have really sort of have noticeably substantially lower crash rate than humans? And this is really, and so to ask a question about safety of ADS and to make comparisons, we need to define, and I've been using crash rates. So safety is generally measured by a crash rate, and a crash rate is a simple thing, which is the number of crashes in the numerator divided by the number of miles driven by whatever the thing is that was doing the crashing. And in principle, making comparisons of safety on a crash rate should be pretty straightforward, right? We have human drivers, we count the crashes they get into, we count the miles that they drive. We have ADS, we count the crashes that they get into, we count the miles that they drive, we do division, and then one of those numbers is bigger than the other one. The thing is that I was thinking about this apples to apples idea. So apples to apples is this term that, and in fact, I even looked it up. Where does it come from? I have no idea where it comes from. Wikipedia just went to the game apples to apples. So apples to apples is this notion of a fair comparison. And as I thought about, like, why do we have good intuitive understanding of what a fair comparison is? And I decided that it's because we've been working on this since preschool. Or maybe before that, like thinking about, when you're having a contest, a jumping contest, a running contest, what is a fair context is actually a thing that we actually really understand. So what I'm going to do is sort of break down, maybe in a little more detail, what exactly that fair comparison is. But I do think that people kind of understand. So I'm going to kind of talk about the details and also why this is so hard with present data systems. Okay. So what are the challenges to making sure that a comparison is fair, that is apples to apples? The first thing you have to achieve is you need to measure crashes in the same way. Makes a lot of sense, right? So the way ADS developers measure crashes is that they have vehicles that are loaded with instrumentation, sensors all over the place, and they can make direct measurement of contacts, forces, accelerations, etc. And so you can define a crash on some objective measure of that sort. There was a contact of this amount of force, or there was an acceleration, a pulse of this amount, and you can change the measurement threshold, and but it's replicable, it's objective, it's measured directly, and importantly, it's measured during the driving process, right? So it's measured when the crash occurs. On the human driver data set, the most extensive databases that we have are police report crash databases. We have national data sets. We have state data sets. They've got, millions and millions and millions of crashes in these data sets, which is lovely. But what is a police report? How does a crash that occur get into the police report data set? Well, the crash occurs, and somebody there, the witness or the people involved, decide that maybe the police need to come. And there's a variety of reasons why you might decide that or not decide that, which includes how bad was the crash and is there sort of an issue and things like that. And then the police officer comes and they make a second decision, which is, does this crash meet the low threshold, the police report threshold for my state? So each state has its own reporting threshold. They're kind of similar. I think we give that a pass. But there are these two human decisions, which are really hard to, so, what is that in delta V terms? What is that in, forces and accelerations? It's really hard to tell. And insurance claims is another way that we can count crashes for humans, and it has exactly the same qualities, but those crashes are a little bit less, they're more inclusive. So of kind of lower level crashes. So more minor crashes will get an insurance claim than will get a police report, if that makes sense. But there's still a decision being made by someone after the fact who says, yes, I want to call and make a claim on my insurance. And some of their decision-making process might be about whether their insurance rates are going to go up or not. And so there's this kind of complicated decision, which again, how do you map that to direct measurement of contacts and forces? When it comes to naturalistic driving studies like SHARP2 and a variety of studies that have been conducted here, IDSS and Safety Pilot, now we have sensing systems on the vehicles while they're moving that map much better to what ADS manufacturers are doing with their own sensing. So now we have the possibility of defining a crash in terms of accelerations or forces, delta V, that kind of thing. The way it's done in SHARP2 and some other things is there are sort of acceleration triggers followed by a video review. So there's a little bit subjective, but even those video review rules they're heavily sort of practice codified, agreed upon. So it's really pretty, this is a pretty replicable way to do it and mappable way to do it when you have two different vehicles, two different sets of sensors. And then finally, event data recorders are the black boxes in cars, right? And they have accelerometers in them, and they basically record a crash when the crash speed or the delta V crash severity reaches 5 miles an hour, or there might be a bigger threshold, or the threshold has to do with airbag, but it's all measured, it's all repeatable, it's all kind of objective. The second challenge to apples comparison is to measure miles in the same way. So obviously, we want to make sure that we measure not miles and kilometers, but more importantly is the way that miles are sort of measured or aggregated or estimated. So once again, on the ADS side, all kinds of sensors, GPS breadcrumb trail of everywhere they're going. They know everywhere they drive. They know what time of day they drove on what road, probably know what the weather was, at least to some degree. They've got all the information about those routes. On the human driver side, when you're trying to do this with crash data sets, then typically there are no miles in the crash data set. We don't know what people's odometers are doing in that set. But what we do have is national estimates of the vehicle miles traveled. So VMT is generally estimated, it's measured, so there's travel is measured on certain roads with the little boop boop things and the loop detectors and other sort of methods, but it's measured on a small subset of roads and over small sets of time. And then it's aggregated up, it's estimated, combined with gas consumption and some other things into the kind of estimates that are aggregated to broad road classes. So limited access, highway, and a couple other road classes, broad vehicle types that can tell light vehicles from heavy trucks, but, a few things like that, and broad areas. So you've got national, state, county, city. That's about as far down as it gets. In contrast, if we're using naturalistic driving data, once again, we've got the same kind of sensors that you have on ADS. NDS uses complete capture of routes or odometer, but as we'll talk about later, there are some NDS doesn't, it's like, oh, well, why don't we just use NDS? Well, we'll get to that. The third challenge for this is to think about what human drivers we're comparing to. So again, I don't know if I said, it's going to the preschool example or the school example. If you have Mrs. Jones's class and Mr. Peterson's class, and they're doing a running test and they're out on the track running against each other, we think of that as a fair comparison. But if you make Mrs. Peterson's class go up against the track team from the high school, that's not a fair comparison, right? So, or alternatively, you want to know how good is Mrs. Peterson's class at running against a group of, elite runners, right? So you can think about it both ways, but you need to think about who is it that we actually want the ADS to be compared to. So the obvious immediate answer to that, the quick answer, is the average driver, right? Which is a reasonable thing to be asking, or the median driver. But we know that there is a lot of variation in individual human driver crash rate. And we also know from research that all of us are better drivers than the average. And so we might not want the ADS to only be better than that. So maybe we want them to be better than all those people that are bad at stuff. And so we could consider not using the average driver, but instead using something like the careful, competent driver. Because maybe the reason for why we're doing this comparison is that we want to know about how the ADS does. We need it, we want to know what that benchmark is. But in order to do that, we need to have the estimated human driver crash rate for the careful, competent driver, right? So in our data sets, we have to be able to measure that. Another way of thinking about what the appropriate comparison population is to think about what travel the ADS is meant to replace, the sort of replacement ideas. So one possibility is that it's meant to replace just car driving, right? Passenger cars, people are just driving their cars, and then they're just going to get in their ADS, and the ADS is going to drive. It sounds great to me, but that's sort of the average driver notion, right? All of our data sets support that, the average driver notion. But maybe because a lot of ADS are being launched in a rideshare context, maybe what we want to think about is that ADS in current context should be replacing rideshare drivers. That travel in rideshare with human rideshare drivers will transfer to travel in ADS. And if you think about the broad picture of how it's influencing crashing, that's the population we want to know about. Another possibility is, an intriguing possibility, is that so ADS often present themselves as a solution, a end-to-end solution for people who can't drive for one reason or another. So through blindness, disability, age, didn't get a license, any number of things. But maybe those people who are currently taking public transportation. So if we move all of that group of people from public transportation to ADS, then from a big picture crash world, we're actually replacing bus drivers and subway drivers and tram drivers, right? So maybe they are the replacement population. And there's no right answer to this. This is a conversation that you need to have, but it needs to be defined in the context of this comparison. So the last challenge to the whole apples to apples fandango is the too few miles problem. So the too few miles problem is really built around, so this is Langrich's triangle, and what it is meant to sort of illustrate is the idea that the worse the outcome, fatality, serious injury, the less likely the event. So events that are less bad happen more often. That's a good thing. We like that. However, from a data perspective, if I say to you, if somebody says to me, are ADS safer than humans, just colloquially, probably what you're thinking, or at least I think what people are thinking is that is freedom from bodily harm. So I'm thinking about, why don't I want to get in a crash? I don't enjoy fender benders. I don't enjoy being, stopped up. But what I'm worried about is being hurt. And so what people are really thinking about safety, I think, has a lot to do with serious injury and up. And those are the ones that we don't. You need way too many miles to really focus on those events. And that is especially true if we're driving around in the, sort of like slow in the driveway. If we're staying on lower speed roads as a means of sort of ensuring reasonable safety, all reasonable choices, but those are places where these things don't happen so much. So, what does that, and I'll talk a little bit about how we kind of overcome, or how we might be able to overcome that problem. But that's just a problem in the amount of data that there is. And again, I'll sort of go to that later. So, and one more thing I guess I can say about that is that the mileage thing is not about the comparison, but about how precise our comparison is. So our ability essentially to statistically distinguish the estimate of that event rate, serious crash event rate for humans from the serious crash event rate for ADS. So it's all about that statistical significance problem. Okay, so let's talk about data, sort of approaches that have been taken in the literature. This is really about, again, the human driver crash rate. So unless, the comparison piece, well, first of all, I don't have access to those data, unless, that's being sort of done by people who do have access to those data. So this is really about, what's been done to kind of estimate comparable, reasonable comparison human driver crash rates. So police report data, as I mentioned, is generally the most used and most available and sort of the biggest sample. So when you're trying to generate a human driver crash rate for an apples to apples comparison, the advantages of the police report data is that we do have very large sample sizes. So millions of crashes in state crash databases, national crash databases, huge sample sizes. And obviously people are driving 3 trillion miles a year to produce these data for you. We have very wide and useful geographic size. Wide or useful? Useful is really like, is it relevant to geographic coverage? Does it cover the places where ADS are being deployed, crashing? But there's it's the whole country. We have geographic coverage. We have a lot of crash detail. We have including location, time of day of the week, all that kind of thing. So all those things are really good. You can really select down. What we don't have, as I talked about before, is a objective, quantitative, replicable crash definition. We also don't have mileage data for this in this same data set. We don't have mileage. So you have to step outside and you have to go to a VMT data set, at which point VMT is aggregated and it's aggregated up to levels. So we have some geographic filtering. We can tell VMT in Arizona versus Michigan and down to, counties, but we don't have it for these people driving on these roads. Insurance is very similar with the caveat that they actually don't have location of crashes in their data sets. So they might get copies of police reports potentially, but that's a PDF. So typically it's not in the data set. And so what they use typically is they actually use the insured people's home address. So it is known that people generally travel near their homes and they generally crash near their homes because they crash where they travel. So home location is a reasonable proxy for driving and crashing, but it is not the same as driving and crashing, right? It's not where the crashes occur, it's where they live. They also don't have mileage data. They don't have travel data for the study population, so they have to go outside for that, and usually to the same data sets. And then similarly, geographical filtering of VMT has this tracing problem. Naturalistic driving data has kind of the opposite profile. So it's lots of crash detail, we have mileage data for the study population. We have extensive geographic filtering of mileage possible down to the specific road. We have an objective and replicable and quantitative definition of crashes. What we don't have in the existing naturalistic driving data sets is wide geographic coverage. So SHARP 2, biggest naturalistic driving study in the world, 6 locations, about 3,500 drivers, like 35 million miles, something like that. And unfortunately, those locations are largely not where the ADS are being developed. So it ends up being, it's a lot of effort that goes into those in kind of localized areas. And then the question of, is the sample size large or not? It's all relative, but relative to police report data sets, it's not. So nothing here is perfect. It might be worthwhile to think a little bit about, well, what would be perfect? What would the ideal comparison be? In just a second, we'll talk about that. So if we could do anything we wanted, then the randomized control trial is the gold standard of comparison, right? So if you consider the COVID vaccine, so lightning speed development, but they didn't just release it into the wild. They had to do an RCT. In the medical world, everything that gets developed goes through an RCT at some point. Because we'll sort of talk about why. So the way the COVID vaccine trials went, give or take, I'm paraphrasing those or illustrating, but basically, you have a nurse and the participant comes into the room, shows up. She goes to the box of vials of stuff and pulls out number 1, and she puts it in, attaches it to the needle, sticks the needle in, and the participant goes away, and then they get tested, many frequent testing over time, and perhaps they come back. But neither the nurse, it could be a he, sorry, neither the nurse nor the participant knows which thing they got. And they have a 50-50 chance of having gotten the vaccine or having gotten the placebo, right? Why is this compelling? It's compelling because if you let the COVID vaccine out into the wild, if you do this observationally, and this in fact was shown to happen after the COVID vaccine then was released and people were allowed to get it and to choose whether they were getting it, what happened was that people who were sort of more risk averse for whatever reason tended to engage in several things that would limit their exposure to COVID. So one of those things was to get the vaccine, but other things was to mask or socially distance. People of different ages were differently likely to get the vaccine. So COVID, I know you all know this, COVID was an old person's disease. And so older people tended to get the vaccine in larger proportions. And so the problem here is what we want, this is a causal diagram, right? So what we want to know is, what is the causal effect of getting the vaccine on your risk of getting sick? We want this arrow, but what happens is if you let these things change, people who engage in certain behaviors, those behaviors are influencing their probability of getting sick, and those behaviors are influencing the probability of getting the vaccine. So when you make this measurement, you take all the vaccinated people and you compare their COVID rates to all the not vaccinated people, you're mixing up the action of the vaccine with the actions of the people who get the vaccine or the ages of the people, right? So this is, so we have confounding. So what the RCT does is it breaks this link. It says, no matter what your age, no matter what your, social distancing strategy is, when you come into that room and you have a 50% chance of getting the placebo and a 50% chance of getting the vaccine, right? So we break that link, and now everything that you observe in that RCT is the direct effect, causal, of the vaccine on COVID. So what would that look like for ADS? Well, first of all, we need an experimenter, a scientist. And we all know that all scientists have test tubes and that they're pouring from one thing to another. That's how you can tell that she's a scientist. And our scientist, I don't know what the heck she's doing with those things, but anyway, So she recruits some participants. And so participant number one shows up, and participant one has travel demand. They have a travel need. They want to go to point A. So they come into the lab, and our scientist flips a coin. Coin comes up heads, and heads is human driver. And she's like, okay, human driver, go. Off we go. And then the next participant comes into the lab, and this person has travel demand needs that need to be met. They want to go to point B. And our scientist says, okay, we'll flip a coin. And this time it comes up tails. Could have been heads. But because it came up tails, the AV shows up, the ADS shows up, and our second participant drives off with the AV. And we do this over and over and over again. Another way that she might have constructed this, slightly different, is that she maps out a bunch of routes and a bunch of times of day and a bunch of days of the week. So it's just like over a long period of time, you're like, I've got a route 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and we're going to go at these times. And then basically for each one, you flip that coin and you say, okay, the AV is going to do this one, the person's going to do this one, the AV is going to do this one. You could also structure it and make sure that in your final data set, the AVs and the people over time, not at the same time, we don't want them driving one in front of the other. And so they're driving the same routes or possibly the same trips. They're driving at the same times of day of the week over time. We measure both of them. We instrument both of them in the same way. So we're measuring crashes the same way. We choose the human drivers from the pool that we want, right? So either these are rideshare drivers or they're regular drivers or they're, whatever we want. And then we have to run enough trips or miles to observe the crashes that we're able to measure. So why does this work, right? The thing we want to know, again, causal diagram, the thing we want to know is, does whether you are an ADS or a human driver causally influence your crash risk for this trip or that trip? But the problem is that in the wild, ADS are choosing certain road types for lots of good reasons. People are choosing road types largely because they need to go somewhere, and it's largely because it's the fastest way or they're comfortable or whatever. But we know that roads are not equally, the underlying crash risk for roads, no matter who you are, no matter what you're driving, is not equal across all road types. So, for example, take the fatality rate on interstates is less than half of the fatality rate on local roads. And certainly lower level crashes are much more common in more complex environments. Less complex environments, fewer crashes. So road type matters. And if the ADS is choosing different roads for the people, now we've got this causal pathway operating. Similarly, time of day, right? So time of day, if you drive in congested traffic, rear end crashes are much more likely. If you drive at certain times of day, certain things are more likely to happen. And ADS is the developers are potentially choosing times of day in a different way than people choose. And so now we've got yet another alternate pathway to crash risk. And finally, specific location. So it matters if you're driving, underlying crash risk matters if you're driving in San Francisco versus if you're driving in Phoenix versus Ann Arbor versus Boston versus the middle of nowhere. So all of these things are influencing so when we're just taking ADS and, look at their crash rate, and then we're taking humans and look at their crash rate, we're bundling all of this stuff in there unless we do something about it. So the RCT basically blocks these pathways, equates everything. But with observational data, so observational data is used for all kinds of things. We cannot run RCTs on everything. We probably can run an RCT here. We'll talk about that a little bit later. You can't run an RCT to find out if smoking causes cancer, right? Here's your cigarette, you don't get one. And so observational data methods have been heavily developed to also block these pathways, to find ways. And that's what we're trying to do with our apples to apples comparison, is get everything sort of contained in such a way that these are no longer reasons for why one crash rate is bigger than another. So what's a gap? So there's a lot of gaps, and these are some gaps. We got a matching crash definition problem, right? A matching trips, roads, or ODD. These are all things that influence risk that we don't want included in our comparison. Time of day, replacement drivers is it's less of a problem and more of a conversation, I think, there. And then having insufficient miles. So nothing's perfect. What do we want to do about it? So the first recommendation that I have is, I think there are ways to improve the human driver crash data. I will say, as an aside, I sometimes wonder if it's worth the trouble, because one day it's not going to matter what the human driver crash rate is because things will be different enough. But as of late, it seems like that's taking longer than maybe we thought some time ago. And so maybe it is worth it. Maybe it is worth improving the human driver data in certain small ways that would really help to make these comparisons easier, right? So what's sort of the perfect human driver crash data? Well, the semi-perfect human driver crash data set is one where we can draw an arbitrary ODD, time, space, any kind of variable that you want to deal with, and we can draw it around crashes, and we can select crashes into it. We'd like that to include even like the travel purpose or the kinds of people. And then we can do the same thing on the travel side. So we can say, okay, these roads are traveled in this way by these people. That would be lovely. But so to try to sort of move towards that, move a little closer to that, changing police report crash data sets is really hard. Making changes to the police report is it's like a 10-year operation, and states are actually, that's a story for another day. But a couple of small items might, I think, actually be helpful. And so one of them is to add data on travel purpose. We did some analysis trying to understand the difference between the crash rates for rideshare drivers and regular drivers. And we only found one. Illinois was the only one that we found that marked it to the point where we could actually look at those crash experiences. But the other thing that I think might actually be useful is to add detail on vehicle damage, so that we could begin to get closer to mapping what is a police reportable crash relative to what is measured in terms of damage to a vehicle. So this is a stretch, and there's a whole research project involved in this sort of assumption. But I think that some further information about crashes that lead us to understand what that threshold looks like might be helpful. On the VMT side, disaggregation is the thing that we so desperately need in order to deal with this, right? And so the ideal scenario is disaggregation of travel all the way down to the road segment by time, by day of the week, by season level. And what's interesting is that the information is potentially there. So a lot of it is estimated, but these sort of daily patterns of travel is known. Any road that has a loop detector on it has a daily travel pattern that's being recorded. And so maybe some additional data collection to make the estimates, these sort of small scale estimates better, but potentially sort of finding ways to reasonably disaggregate, again, down to maybe specific roads. I think it's not impossible to do that. The next suggestion that I have is to actually conduct new studies, purpose-built studies. So we have partnered with GM, Cruise, and VTTI to conduct a purpose-built study, the goal of which was to generate a human driver crash rate that was completely tailored to the Cruise ODD and to the replacement drivers, which were envisioned as rideshare drivers. Okay. So everybody that we followed in the study was a rideshare driver doing rideshare for Maven. And we had two kinds of data collection. VGTI did an instrumented vehicle fleet, and you can see the small yellow circle there sort of represents the sample size that they had. So they had a lot of detail, obviously, in cameras and the whole 9 yards, and they were able to detect crashes down to very low levels. So Sharp 2 kind of strategy for that, but it's a very small sample, right? So they had a total of about 400,000 miles, which was, and the UMTRI fleet had a total of 5 million miles. So the UMTRI data came through GM's OnStar system. It was collected telematically, right? So it came relatively cheaply, lots and lots of miles, but and we had breadcrumb trails of where people went. So both data sets knew exactly where drivers were driving, how many miles they were driving, what roads they were driving on, and what time they were driving on those roads, and all of that. The crash detection on the telematics side came from two sources. One was EDR, again, highly replicable, but with a 5 mile an hour threshold, meaning that that's a worse crash than the lowest level naturalistic driving data crashes by, it's not a bad crash, but it's a worse crash. And then also insurance claims, which was quite an interesting addition. We learned a lot about what gets captured by a 5 mile an hour delta V versus what gets captured by the NDS methods. But anyway, that's again a story for another day. And then we did some Bayesian fusion stuff on this and generated an estimate. But importantly, sort of saying this again, but rideshare drivers, purpose-built for a specific replacement population. Cruise ODD, purpose-built to be able to fully dive into the specifics of where Cruise was able to, chose to go. And we were inclusive of very minor crashes, in part because their total mileage wasn't high enough to see worse crashes. So the things that were kind of cool about this were, is we had detailed selection of driving and crashing. The telematics approach really allowed us, we were able to get very detailed selection. The nice thing, of course, is it's wildly bigger miles and wildly cheaper than running instrumented vehicle studies. So this was pretty important, and I think is transferable, right? So you could do this in other locations, and you could do it with other ODDs. But it does have to be done for every ODD, and you have this basic problem, which is that even with the 5 mile an hour threshold, we still are, not seeing gobs of serious crashes, but good. So as an aside, we estimated the crash rate to be about 65 crashes per million ODD driving miles. And when other people went and sort of looked at police report data and did some adjustments to sort of reduce the threshold, they were pointing out that this rate was like 4 to 5 times higher than the rate that you estimate with police report crashes. So it's reasonable to look at that and be like, well, hey, that bar is way too, that's way too easy to meet. That's not reasonable. But for me, so yes, legitimate to be concerned about that. But for me, what it illustrates, first of all, is how different crash rates estimated by different means can be. But also the fact that we went in with a plan that made sense. It was sort of rational argument. And this is what came out of it. So coming out of it, you can sort of look at that and say, oh, wow, these are not great drivers. And also that crash definition is very inclusive. And that's, again, legit, but it needs to be replicated. So again, this is just the human driver stuff. I'm not talking. But it does mean that you sort of get to that and then you're like, oh, okay, all right, this is a result, right? This is an interesting result. And then how exactly you do decision making on that is another thing. But this approach was pretty interesting. Okay. In the world of collect more data, why not do an RCT? Why not? We could do this. It's not actually impossible. It seems impossible. It's not impossible. What I think about this is partly RCTs are done in medical field for a thing like the COVID vaccine. Interestingly, they did the RCT, and again, I know you'll know this. And so the RNA vaccine can be changed, and they have been changing it. But when they did that RCT, they literally couldn't, you couldn't touch the vaccine. You couldn't change it. And they couldn't even for a while give it to kids because the study only started with 12-year-olds, right? So there was a lot of rigidity in the RCT kind of world that then got transferred to what comes after. And that's part of the rules of medical device. We have a situation where there's continuous change in software, continuous or ideally improvement in the ADS. And so, which day do you want to run your RCT and what do you want to conclude from it? But I do think that if there were a gating decision that was a big deal, like, oh, I don't know, let's take all the human drivers off the road. That's a pretty big deal, gating decision as a hypothetical. Maybe we want to do an RCT at that point, or maybe we want some other gating decision to be RCT level. And then my last sort of study suggestion, which this is a thing we've been talking about. So I don't know if you guys so the Nielsen, is that like a thing people know anymore? Do the kids know what the Nielsens are? So Nielsen is the company that does, they interview people, they like get data from people about what TV they're watching, what radio they're listening to and stuff like that. It's like, old people like me. But the thing about it is this ongoing study. I think they're still doing it. They've been doing, Nielsen ratings. They've been doing it for like decades and decades. And so it's just ongoing sampling, surveying of people and their media watching behavior. If we did the Nielsens of driving, what we envisioned, and we've been talking about this for 15 years here, so as we got nowhere, is to design and implement an ongoing study of how people travel and how they crash and where they go. And I think that having that as a resource for managing this problem would actually be pretty cool, and it would answer a whole bunch of other questions. But that one's not cheap. So, okay. So number 3 is use surrogates, but choose wisely. As we've talked about, small samples of miles mean that assessments of injury crashes really are effectively somewhere in the range of currently impossible. I'll kind of talk about that, but they are, let me rephrase, that's not fair. The estimates have high uncertainty. This is all about the uncertainty in the estimate, right? And on the ADS side, largely, although sometimes when we're dealing with these NDS type studies, it can also be on the human side. We just don't know. But literally, there's this moment of so the RAND report that was billions of miles to assess fatalities, and everybody's like, what are we going to do? Oh, can't do anything. You literally can't do anything about that, right? So the only thing you can do is decide that you're going to deal with it a little bit differently. And the only thing that we can do, is measure things that occur more often. And so that's what surrogates are. It is ironic to be trying to measure the most severe thing and then go all the way down to the less severe thing. But I think that if we start tracking, if we choose surrogates really carefully for specific qualities, that we can actually make headway on these kinds of things. So specifically what I mean, commercial aviation has this really beautiful data sharing platform called ASIAS. And one of the things that they track, so commercial aviation, their crash rates are so low that there's, they can't estimate anything, right? But what they do is they've defined a set of undesirable states that are not just predictors of crash risk. So hard braking is everybody's favorite driving surrogate. The insurance companies are changing your insurance rates on the basis of your hard driving. Everybody's using it. But hard braking is a predictor. It occurs for a variety of reasons. It probably occurs more when you have more complex driving. It certainly occurs more when it's correlated with crashes. But do you want to stop people from hard braking when the crash is occurring? In theory, if they're braking hard, maybe that actually makes the crash less likely because they're doing something about it. But anyway, hard braking is not strictly an undesirable state. It's a predictor. But low time to collision, so time to collision is a measure that says, how long is it going to take you to hit the vehicle in front of you, all of the things staying the same, right? Low time to collision is an undesirable state. You don't want to be in that state. You want to be in a not low time to collision state, ideally. And so tracking when short time to collision, small values of time to collision and close proximities, let's say to pedestrians and things like that, those things are things that if you make adjustments, solve small problems before they become big problems, potentially this is sort of a useful way to think about safety assessment and also to think about sort of how to sort of make things better. The other thing about the undesirable states is that I think it is possible in certain circumstances to use these along with extreme value theory, which estimates tails of distribution and blah, blah, blah for another time. But there is a possibility of actually using it to estimate how many more severe events, higher delta V, that kind of thing. So when you have this kind of direct relationship between the nature of that surrogate and sort of what might come if things play out. So this, I think, is just a thing that people should be, like surrogates, getting beyond surrogates as predictors and moving to something that's more carefully selected, I think is important. And then the last thing is, we can't let the perfect become the enemy of the good, right? Okay, so there is no perfect system. There is no perfect data system. There is no perfect way to measure human driver crashes in the exact same ODD on those short of running a study or doing data collection. So the data systems don't really exist. The thing that is sort of a struggle, so the situation that we're in with the data systems that we have is that the data systems allow us, so this is my illustration. The blue oval is meant to represent all travel demand. So that includes time and location and whatever else you want to throw in there. People need to get places, and that's why human drivers drive in those places, short of occasional joyriding trips. But for the most part, it's travel demand. And then if you take a general area, and I'll get to what that general area is in just a minute, ADS travel in that same area, but their travel is more limited, and the demand that they serve is more limited, and they control the demand that they serve, right? All for good reason. And so the problem is that we are using the blue information to estimate human driver performance exclusive to the green area, right? So if you look at something like a national crash data benchmark, the travel in the area that we're measuring for national crash data is the whole country. And ADS developers are largely over in the Southwest or in San Francisco. And there's some here too and in other, but they're in little tiny areas. So why are they in Phoenix? They're in Phoenix because there's no weather there. There's big straight roads, they're wide, all of which is completely reasonable. If you're doing development on a system that's hard to do, why would you? I mean, some people are trying to solve snow before, and people are trying to solve San Francisco before Phoenix, but cautious choices for development are very justified and very reasonable. But if you're trying to compare, they make a bad comparison because essentially the ADS developers are sort of looking at what is, what do they feel confident in? And we're using an estimator of what everybody's doing to estimate what human drivers would do in that area. So if indeed they're picking areas where driving is sort of safer and crashing is less likely, it's probably the case that human drivers would also drive more safely and crash less in those areas. So while a lot of the apples to apples sort of conversation in the literature and in media and stuff is sort of about this, is like regaming the system, or is this a fair comparison, or is this a good estimator, and that kind of thing. But I think at some point, if you look over to the right, so Maricopa County, so benchmark for Maricopa County was published by Scanlon et al. Along with some other benchmarks. But when you get down to the level of Maricopa County, which contains Phoenix, then I think at some point we have to say, this is as far down as we can drill spatially with the data sets that we have. And it's actually not unreasonable to think that the blue human travel is a reasonable estimator for how humans would do in the green. Might be imperfect, but it might be informative. It can be useful. And so then we can sort of move on to say, well, okay, if we want to be cautious, maybe we'll want them to beat it by 5 times. Or if we want to be, it's like, are we, why are we doing this? Is this an academic discussion? I don't know. Are ADS safer than humans? Or are we actually thinking about what does that mean? What is the next step? What is the gating? So depending on what the purpose of this comparison is, maybe we want to think a little bit more about how critical it is to be perfect. So to conclude, the perfect data for the perfect apples-to-apples comparison just doesn't exist. But it should be possible to move away from focusing on the perfection of the comparison and still be able to make useful inferences about where we are at and where we want to be in the end, which is here. Thank you. Question? Oh, yes.
That was really, really engaging and interesting. One question I had was, and I have a lot of questions that I'll ask you later.
Okay, yeah, you get one, and then we'll move it around.
One question I had was that when you were doing the challenges for the apples-to-apples comparison,
yes,
you talked about comparing people, comparing types of roads on which they were driving. You didn't actually mention comparing types of vehicles. And I understand that vehicle technology is what you want to compare, but you are actually very specifically interested in automated technologies. And there are non-automated technologies that matter for crashes. So, for example, quality of brakes, engine capacity, you're driving a high-performance vehicle.
Yep.
So, one, simply, do you agree that those should be, that should be a challenge, and you want the same thing to be compared? And if so, then I imagine that in the RCT, the person who doesn't get the ADS should get exactly the same vehicle with the same engine capacity. The only thing that's missing is the ADS part. And so then I love the idea of the RCT. Why is it not being done? Is it logistically possible? Like the samples, what are the sample sizes required? If we did it in months, can it be done?
Yeah, and so that's really good. So let me take the first one first. Yes, I agree with you. So everything's on the table, right? For what is apples to apples. And I think that some of what you're talking about, so you can think about it in two ways. When I show this diagram, one of the things I didn't say and probably should have is that I think that everything that is along the bottom, maybe I should have put them in a different color, but everything on the bottom needs to be a thing that has a pretty good sized effect on crash risk, right? We don't have to worry about color. For example, color, I think we can agree that the color of the vehicle, in spite of the thing about red cars or whatever the heck it is, the color of the vehicle doesn't matter for crash risk. So we don't care if like ADS are all white and people drive different colored vehicles. But yes, exactly. So ADAS packaging, the newness of the vehicle, those kinds of things can influence crash risk for sure. And so the two ways you can think about it is you can say, well, humans drive a variety of cars. This is what we experience on the roads, which is coming from a variety of cars, right? So we can say the situation that we have now that we want to compare to is people just driving whatever they're driving, and it's going to come to us in the crash data and the VMT data in proportion to how many people have ADAS and how many people don't. That's one way to think about it. So we accept it as a source of variation. Alternatively, we don't like that, then we're actually going to control for it. And this is kind of the question is, here is this goes to the replacement population or the, are we replacing, is ADAS replacing people driving cars with good ADAS systems? Well, now the crash risk goes down somewhat. And then, I think that's, to me, that's a conversation that, that's kind of the argument that, or conversation you can say, I think we should be, testing at this. In RCT, 100% agree. So in the RCT, the ideal scenario is that you have the same exact vehicle and it's just not tricked out with the ADS, or you turn it off, or whatever the thing is. But you're trying to isolate the contribution of the human driver from the contribution of the ADS brain. And we can offline have conversations about what the ADS brain gets to take credit for. Never making a left turn across path. That's a legitimate safety move. Maybe you credit that to the ADS. Maybe you make everybody left turn across path and just like, hey, if you can't do it, bro, then that's your problem. But so anyway, yeah. And then the second question was, why aren't we doing RCTs? I will say that I have had conversations about RCTs with people in the industry. So it's not that nobody's thought about it. I think people think of it as, well, partly the moving target, I think, is a piece of the problem. So I think you do need a moment. But actually, my husband, who was forced to listen to this talk like 5 times yesterday, we were having a conversation. He's like, why can't you run an RCT? Like, how hard can it be? So, so here we go. Here's an RCT. Waymo is out driving. Their cars drive. It's Monday. They drive X, Y, and Z. And the following Monday, you recruit somebody and they drive X, Y, Z. And it's Monday at the same time of day. And you just do that for a while. And so what's the expense of that is recruiting those drivers and getting them to drive. I did look a little bit about, we are talking about, I think, a couple million miles for that, at least for that, for that to work. I could do some math on it. It's an interesting mental exercise. But I actually do think that it should not be off the table. I think it should be on the table, at least conversation. Yeah. So, yeah, sorry, you had a question? I can.
You talked about different road segments having different, say, crash rates. Has anybody done a good definition of what different road segments exist? Like, so you could then go, hey, the crash rate at Rotaries is this, the crash rate driving across I-10 in West Texas is this. And to me, as an engineer, I want to select which of those I'm going to prove I'm better at. And I want to know what the crash rates, the whatever rates are.
What that would be.
I'm trying to prove that I'm better.
Yeah, that's kind of that's a real holy grail kind of data set thing, So
well, I'm asking you just the definition.
Yeah.
When I said these are the
5
yes.
types of roads.
OpenStreetMaps is one version of that. So each state has to have a linear referencing system with roads, and that's based on road segments and road segment characteristics, and they have to send data to the federal highway through the highway performance monitoring system, blah, blah, blah. But OpenStreetMaps is one that we use quite a bit, actually, because it is open. And so they've got everything broken up into segments. It's from here to here and here to here. And the segments tend to be between nodes, which are intersections and so on. So, yeah, I mean, the road segment breakdown is there. Each segment has a road type associated with it, a speed limit, a number of lanes, crash. It has features associated with it. And then the next sort of thing is, how many crashes are there and how many miles. And the thing that I would love to have in a VMT data set is to have what is the travel volume on that segment at this time of day on this, this day of the week. That's kind of the version that I think is not impossible to get to, where you could actually SQL your way into that database and pull out, okay, now I think there's this many people, and you can get the crashes from somewhere else tagged to that road segment. Yeah. You have a question? Yep. Sorry.
Because there's a number of online.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Yes.
Let me just ask one
Go for it.
question.
Yes.
Interesting as well. And it's basically asking you to comment on Tesla's safety report recently released.
Yeah.
So I don't want you to get into any trouble, but
Yeah,
anything you want to comment on that? And then there's questions is that, do you consider that as a scientific study with their technology? If not, what new data would you want to add?
lucky for me, I haven't read it, and I will, and I'll think about that and I'll answer it. How's that? I think apples to apples. And so what I will say is that historically with Tesla, and of course Tesla is not. I mean, Tesla is kind of a weird combination of ADAS and, is it automated, is it not? But the challenge for that we do know from other ADAS studies, level 2 studies, is that people engage level 2 systems in safer environments than what they choose to drive themselves. We see this in studies, Super Cruise and things like that. And so to the extent that Tesla drivers are doing that, then just looking at the miles where it's not engaged against the miles where it is engaged is not an apples to apples comparison, because people have already they're selecting when they're going to let the robot drive and when they're going to do it on their own. And so again, I haven't read this, and again, I promise I will, and I'll write a response which you can send out to us, whatever. But that has historically been the issue, I think, that is legitimately raised with the Tesla comparisons. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Carol. And I think Carol will stay a little bit.
Yeah.
I don't want to.
Yeah, no problem.
I have a follow-on question. That's
Okay,
really
well,
important.
maybe 1 minute.
Non-academic question.
Mhm.
I put on 2 shoes, OEM shoes, regulatory shoes.
Yep.
As an OEM, I have every incentive to sell ADS. So therefore, I really need the benchmarking data.
Yes.
As an OEM, I hold a lot of data cards. Counterpoint, regulatory. This goes to your point, is you'll never get perfect information.
Oh.
Where does this research need to be good enough that NHTSA and others will act on making some of these things standard?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, so this is sort of what, I will say what troubles me about the sort of back and forth conversation that's going on now, and maybe, now I get myself in trouble, but the sort of getting to the point where everybody's like, oh yes, that's the perfect study, I think doesn't happen until we have run a randomized controlled trial. But as much as I'm open to that possibility, I feel like that's a very high bar for the perfection of the study. So I do think that one way that maybe people can be okay with stuff is if you move the bar, if you say, you're not meeting the average driver, you're going to have to beat the capable competent driver, and to be significantly better than that. In a way, what I've done is I've created margin against this problem of the sort of failure of apples to apples. So it's arbitrary. It's not, it's not like I know the margin is this amount because I don't know what the margin is. Another option is that if ADS developers were willing to, provide their exact, the driving heat map by day and place, and then there might be a way to kind of look at that and go, oh yeah, okay, I don't know, we think this is the inherent risk underlying these road segments and these kinds of days, and so we're going to make this adjustment, that kind of thing. But we won't have human data that can. So that's kind of what I think is that trying to figure out if the average is one side or another. I think it will always lead to this whole but the people are driving in, more complex environments, or they're, or blah, blah, blah. But if the differences are extreme enough, then maybe at that point there's action that can be taken. But it's a good question. And again, purpose-built study might actually be the way to approach that.